So it looks like, here, I'll make sure I got my phone off too. We're going to shoot for maybe about a half hour to present, and then however much time we have for discussion. So I got this together not too long ago. This is some research that I put together actually quite a long time ago, and I've never really been able to do anything with this particular study, and so this is kind of the next thing I'm working on, maybe towards a publication. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma in Chickasha. I'm a sociologist, and my specialty is a sociology of religion, and my subspecialty is atheism and secular studies. And so I did my dissertation on the stigma of being secular in the Midwest, and I looked specifically at secular people who lived in kind of the middle of the country. And I ended up collecting some data that I wasn't expecting, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And this is some international data. I wasn't looking outside of the Midwest of the United States at all, and I just kind of happened upon some data. So what we're going to start with today, just a couple basic things, is the idea of religious diversity in a global perspective. And specifically, I want to talk about secularism and loss of religion, if you want to think of it that way, or apostasy or atheism in an international light. So there's a lot of data that's been coming out recently. Pew Research has been kept really, really busy with this group called the Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, non-affiliates. What we know about the Nuns is they were only about 7% of the population in 1990, and by 2000, they had grown to about 14%. 10 years later, in 2010, they were up to 21%, and right now we're hinging right around 25%. Pew Research, the latest poll, showed that no religion is the second largest religious tradition in America after evangelicals, and now pulling ahead of Catholics. It's the first time they've ever been polled ahead of Catholics. So if you want to think about it in this terms in America, in the United States, we've got evangelical Protestants at about 27%, the Nuns at 25%, the Catholics at 23%, mainline Protestants at about 18%, and then you've got Black, Protestant, other, and Jewish, kind of like in that order. So it's been a huge shift from 7% to 25%. Want to give a caveat. I know I'm here speaking with mostly, I don't know for sure, but mostly those who would consider themselves non-believers or skeptics of some sort. The Nuns are about 2/3 what we call unchurched believers, or spiritual but not religious. Only 1/3 of those would identify as agnostic or atheist. So for the most part, the agnostic and atheist camp has been growing with the Nuns, but still a very small portion of the country. One of the biggest changes that we found is the number of people who have actually been willing to self-identify as atheist in the United States. For the longest time, it was hinging right around 0.5%, like about half of 1%. Even though 3% of people did not believe in God and expressed belief in God, only about half of 1% would actually say that. Now we're bumped up to nearly 3% by the latest polls. So that is a huge change in terms of the number of people who are willing to use that self-descriptor. And surveys vary on this type of stuff, but for the most part, we know that that's been growing proportionately. All right, so how does the U.S. compare to the rest of the world when it comes to secularism and religiosity? The United States is a really interesting case study in that we know in the industrialized Western world, we stand as one of the most religious countries, on par with some of the more conservative developing nations. Compared to Western Europe, we generally have tended to be far more religious in a lot of different attributes. And what we're going to do today is kind of go through some of those statistics and parse them out. And then I'm going to go through some of my data and what I did in my own independent research, and kind of show what it means towards, what it means for in terms of impacting the lives of secularists who are living in different parts of the world. Okay, so let's go through some basic rundown. So if we look at weekly church attendance, I just pulled some of the statistics I could find. This comes from the World Values Survey, which is a survey that's administered about every 5 to 10 years on average. Not all countries are surveyed, but most countries are surveyed. All the big ones generally fall under the survey, so I just grabbed a few here. So weekly church attendance, we've got the US at about 40%. We've got France at roughly over 15%, the UK at over 10%, and Australia at under 10%. This is the number, the percentage of people, adults, who report attending church once per week. So the United States is leading the Western world by far. There were a few countries I could have added that would have been closer to the U.S. Ireland would have been a little bit closer. Italy would have been a little bit closer. But for the most part, the United States buries these other countries when it comes to weekly church attendance. I also want to state this. When it comes to survey data, all of this survey data comes from someone who goes around and asks someone questions like, how often do you attend church? So that 40%, a lot of scholars have actually figured that's more like 25%. Social desirability inflates that enormously. So if the United States is polling at about 25%, I'm guessing France really isn't 16% either. It's probably more like 10% proportionally. So the people who say they go to church really want you to know that they go to church, in other words. Same thing with voting. According to the General Social Survey in the last election, 74% of Americans voted. That's not even relatively close. Also, I think it was like 64% said they voted for Obama, which was not also anywhere close. People like a winner. So yeah, self-reported surveys has its limitations. So this is importance of religion, and this is actually the percentages that I'm showing on this screen is actually the percentage of people who report that religion is not important to them. So on the World Value Survey, they say how important is religion to you, and you can reverse code it for religion is not important to me at all, and this is the percentage that falls into this category. And I didn't get all of the nations that are listed on the World Value Survey, but I have several here. And as you can see in the United States, we're hinging right around 25%, something like that. So about 25% of Americans would say religion is really not that important to me, which falls in line with about the percentage of people who are non-affiliates, right? So it's pretty consistent. Italy's actually pretty close to us at about 26%. I'm guessing they've got some Catholic influence there. Ireland is kind of the same deal, but even in Ireland, over 40%. Once you get Germany, UK, when we get to the Scandinavian countries, my people, we see, and Lauren's people, there's something about the Swedes and the Danes too. All those countries are right about 80%. About 80% of people would say religion is not important to me at all. I had a professor who did a lot of work in Sweden, and she said something interesting. She said, in Sweden, if you say you go to church, in some ways it's almost like if you say you don't go to church here. Like people, not necessarily that they're going to negatively judge you, but they might be a little bit skeptical of you. Like, well, what kind of church do you go to? You know, is it one of those crazy ones, or are you a sane Lutheran, or are you, like they've got Pentecostals now in Sweden, or is it something like that? And so the United States, compared to pretty much anywhere else in Western Europe, would report higher importance of religion for everyday Americans. And then this is the nuns, religious non-affiliation. And this is by continent, and this is what I'm going to be focusing on today because this is the best way I could organize my data. This is the percentage of non-affiliates by continent, and so this is not a great representation, but just to kind of show you where the United States is compared to other places. So, not the United States, North America, so we have to include Mexico and Canada. So about 17% of religious non-affiliates, and by the way, Mexico is going to have a lot of religious affiliates. Canada, actually non-affiliation is about the same as the United States, not much different. Canada is going to be heavily Catholic in the east, and there's going to be also some Catholic influence in the west, not nearly as much. The mountainous regions of Canada are going to be kind of like the Mountain West in the United States, where it's been traditionally not as religious. But the eastern side of Canada is going to identify very heavily Catholic. Europe, just slightly more in terms of religious non-affiliation. They're going to be a little, I think it was like 18.5% of Europeans are non-affiliates. And as we saw in some of the other data, Europe it's hugely diverse. So we could talk about Italy being a little bit more religiously adherent. Spain's probably going to be slightly more religiously adherent. And then you've got the northern parts, which is not going to be very religious. Asia is notoriously not very religious. China makes up a really large portion of this, by the way, when we're talking about Asia. But if we are classifying continents, Middle Eastern countries are going to fall under Asia, and that's going to suppress that number a little bit. Latin America, very few non-affiliates, and Africa, very, very, very few non-affiliates. So from a global perspective, that's kind of where we sit. Okay, so this study, the question I've got here is, how do American atheists differ from atheists from other parts of the world and how they perceive secular stigma? So this is what I did my dissertation on. I wanted to know how atheists who lived in the Midwestern portion of the United States negotiated this stigmatized status, this deal that they are in some ways discriminated against because of their views, or maybe if not discrimination, just at least some kind of stigma, maybe feeling pressure, anxiety, some sort of prejudice that comes from being an atheist in a very religious country. So I originally sent out my survey to atheist groups just like AOK and the Norman Naturalists and other university groups like the one here throughout the Midwest. And I got such a response, such a huge response, that I thought, I'm just going to just take a chance and see if I can go national with this and get some national data, from all over. And I haven't done much with the national data yet because it's taken me so long to publish. I just got my first book chapter published on my dissertation. So this is years down the line. But I sent out emails to everybody I could think of. The Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Center for Inquiry, and probably about 10 to 15 different atheist organizations or skeptic organizations. And I got 2 to help me out, and I appreciate their help. I want to mention them. The Richard Dawkins Foundation for Science and Reason helped me out tremendously, and the James Randi Educational Foundation. I don't know if you're familiar with those. Richard Dawkins Foundation for Science and Reason is a science-based organization that appeals to atheists. It's not an atheist group. James Randi Educational Foundation is also not an atheist group. They are a skeptic community that's dedicated to educating the public about pseudoscience and those different types of things. But both of these guys were really great about posting my survey for about a week on their websites. And through that, I was able to get 1,224 people to take my survey. So it was widely distributed. So I got some international data, which was unintentional, and I felt kind of bad because I had this field open where it said, what state are you from? And I had all 50 states plus the district where you could say that's where you're from. And then I had this other field that was just in case I got someone who didn't fall in there. I thought maybe 1 or 2. And I ended up with a lot of people who didn't live in the United States, and I just didn't even anticipate. The James Randi Education Foundation, I got a lot of Canadians and a lot of New Zealanders and Australians. And not surprisingly, Richard Dawkins Foundation for Science and Reason, a lot of people from the UK. So I ended up with this data pool of international people, along with mostly Americans. But the comments on the survey, and I was hoping to bring it up, but it's a few years old now. The comments that I got on the survey were interesting. First and foremost, they said, I really wish I would have known that this was only for Americans, or I wouldn't have taken it. But I'm glad they did take it, because now I have data for them. And the other thing that they said, and this is why I wanted to extend my survey and my study internationally, was this was on the Richard Dawkins Foundation. Some of the comments that I got were really interesting on the survey. So one person said something along the lines of, this is the silliest survey I've ever taken. Why would anybody care that I'm an atheist? This is ridiculous. And then someone from Alabama was like, try living in Alabama for a week as an atheist, And so, and then it just kind of went on and on, like, yeah, I live in the UK and I've never experienced anything. I live in Australia. Nobody cares about this. And then, someone would say, well, I live in, I think it was somewhere in France, and the part that I live in is really heavily Catholic, and that would be a bad thing to be an atheist. So I'm like, wow, there's a lot of diversity going on here. But in general, the European respondents that were commenting on this section, I had to hold back for not commenting on it. I couldn't do it because I was the researcher. But it was clear that there was this division, this split going on between Americans, the experience of Americans, and the experience of at least the European survey takers. So this is the complete data. There were a few people that I had to get rid of because they didn't answer all the questions. But this is what I ended up with. Just a little under 1,000, 912 people responded from the United States, which was the vast majority. But I got enough data from some other areas to be able to make some comparable, or some decent comparisons. So I got 68 from Canada, and I decided not to make, a North American. Let's see if I can put that back up for you. I decided not to make a North American category because I thought maybe Canadians would be a little bit distinct. It's possible that Canadians might be slightly less religious, maybe experience a little less stigma, maybe a little bit more tolerant. I have 129 from Europe. Most of those are from the UK. They're from Great Britain, they're from Wales, they're from Ireland. There are also a few from France, Germany, Spain, actually Sweden and Norway. I got some of those. Australia and New Zealand I put together had 36, and that was mostly from the James Randi. All of Asia, I only got 10. All of Africa, I only got 4. And all of Latin America, including Mexico, I only got 6. So in my analyses, there you go. In my analyses, I'm actually dropping Africa and Latin America, and it's because the sample size is so small, it doesn't really make sense. 6 and 4 people you can't do much with. I'm reticent to use Asia, but okay, we'll throw it in there for fun. But with these other groups, I have enough to actually make some kind of comparison to be able to see meaningfully how these groups deal with stigma. So the way that I'm thinking of stigma is, this is self-reported, so there's always going to be the issue of bias, but it's the question of, have you ever experienced any type of stigmatization because of your atheist status? And that's basically what all these questions revolved around. What I'm going to be showing is percentages. I've got more fancy statistical analyses that I did. I did binary logistic regressions using different types of fancy stuff that doesn't matter. The important part is when it came to differences, statistically significant differences, the United States and Europe were statistically significantly different in pretty much every case. Canada and the United States didn't differ that much, actually. I thought that we would get more difference on that. And they did on a few, but not a lot of them. Australia and the United States were very different. Okay, so this is perceived stigma, and I'll take you through this graph. We've got a lot of colors and a lot of stuff going on here. So this is, I've got our 5 regions split up, and that's how it's going to be set up for all of the following slides, with the US clustered on the far left, followed by Canada, Europe, Australia, and Asia. It's a lot to look at, so for the time being, I just want you to focus on the orange bars, and that is going to be whether or not you have ever felt judged because you're an atheist. So atheist prejudice. And so this doesn't necessarily mean discrimination, like I didn't get a job. This is, someone treated me differently because I'm an atheist. So if we look at the United States, well over 60%, close to 65% of atheists living in the United States, very common experience. We could probably go around this room and if we told stories long enough, I think I can get that number up to 100. It's just my survey takers probably weren't thinking off the top of their head. The stories that I've encountered anyways, I'd say it's got to be closer to 90, 95%. But 65% reported, yeah, I've been judged because I'm an atheist. So if we're to compare worldwide, Canada, a little under, like between 50 and 60, about 55%. Europe is actually really about 42%, which is very significantly different. So in Europe, only 42% of atheists report experiencing some type of judgment. Australia is a little closer to the United States, about 60%, and Asia is at about 40%. So it kind of comports with the data that we have on how religious these areas are. If we look at the next line of bars, these are the red ones. This is, have you actually ever been discriminated against? And I define this as lost job opportunity, lost romantic opportunity, anything in which you were discriminated. Someone took an action, so not just a thought, not a prejudice, but an actual action where someone said, I'm singling you out and going to take an action that's going to detrimentally affect your life. So that's less prevalent across the board, but still the United States leads the way with close to 30%. I think it was about 27% of American atheists said that they did feel discrimination. Less than 20% of Canadians, a little over 20, or still a little less than 20% of Europeans, about 15% of Australians, and a little over 20% of Asians. So the United States, atheists were far more likely to experience discrimination. And then finally, distress. This was a really important variable for my dissertation. Actually, the last chapter is all about mental health. And this is one of the measures that I used. And it's, have you ever experienced psychological distress because of your atheism? Like, has the issues of your atheist stigma actually made you stressed out? It's affected you psychologically, affected your moods. And in the United States, I mean, just look at that, almost 40%. Canada is actually not too far behind. Canada and the United States ranked about the same. But then if you look at the rest of the world, in Europe, less than 20%, in Australia, about 15%, and in my Asian population, pretty much nobody said they've ever been stressed out because of this. And so this is what I thought was probably most important, and why my European respondents on these comments were saying, I don't understand what the big deal is. I don't understand why I'm taking the survey. I've never felt anything. But if you live in the United States and you're an atheist, what this data says is you're about twice as likely to experience psychological distress because of your atheist status. That could be run-ins with your family. I had a ton of variables on this, by the way. I'd like to parse through it. Whether or not your family is supportive of you, whether or not they're mad at you because you're not raising your kids in the church, whether or not you've had a relationship dissolve because of this. These are all issues that can come up that we can't quite parse from this data, but we do know that there are multiple reasons that you could be stressed out because of this. All right, social support. This was really important. So the orange bar real quick is the percentage of people who say their family is supportive of their atheism. So my family is basically, in general, how would you say the majority of your family is supportive of your atheism? So a positive response here says, yes, a majority of my family is supportive of my atheism. In the United States, only about 30% said, yeah, most of my family supports this. Canada's actually lagging slightly behind the United States. Europe, you're going to see far more support, closer to 50%. In Australia, closer to 60%. And in Asia, almost 75-80% said their family is supportive. The other part of this is to get at peers. And I don't want to ask about friends because you kind of pick your own friends. So you're going to find friends that are supportive. If they're not, I can't imagine they're going to be your friends for a long time. So I thought maybe coworkers is a better proxy for that. So this question was, a majority of my coworkers support my atheist position. And if we look at that, Americans are at the bottom. So close to 60%, which is pretty good. I mean, you're not supposed to discriminate in the workplace, so that would make sense. But still, far less than in other countries. In Asia, it's 100%. Only 10 people, but 100% said, yeah, my coworkers are supportive. I don't know why they wouldn't be. Australia, over 60%, and Europe, close to 80%. So the United States and Canada, again, not showing as much social support. This is really important, by the way. As a sociologist, one of the things we look at when we're concerned about things like psychological distress and well-being is how much support that you have. And this comports with research on LGBT communities. So LGBT individuals who have support from family and friends and coworkers and just their community in general tend to have lower levels of psychological distress attached to their identity. One thing I didn't look at that I really wish I would have is how close atheist identities were for people in the sample. I can only imagine that Americans have much stronger atheist identities, American atheists, compared to other groups from other parts of the world. Okay, so I have two forms of stigma management that I'm looking at, and I'll go through both of these measures. The first one that's represented by the orange bars is I have kept my atheism a secret. So the question was, have you ever purposely kept your atheism a secret to avoid negative encounters? So in other words, I've basically just not said I was an atheist. Over 60% of the US sample, and I think if you thought about it a little bit harder, it would probably be more than that. Canada, a little over 50%, Europe between 20 and 30, Australia, a little over 20, and Asia, about 30, not even close. So the United States, or atheists in the United States, are far more likely to keep it a secret. The other one is passed as religious, and this is probably even more deep form of covert atheism, where it's, have you ever said you were religious so that you didn't get into any tough situations? This is usually with family members, but it could be with others as well. So if you pretended to be religious, and not as many people are willing to do this, but in the United States, it was about 20%. And as you can see in the other red bars there, other parts of the world, it's significantly lower. It doesn't look like it's a lot, but once you put it into odds ratios, it's actually significantly lower. In Europe, you're probably only about half as likely to have lied about your atheist status and said you were religious in order to avoid negative judgment. Outward stigma management, we've got a slightly different story. So outward stigma management is a different form of dealing with your stigma. So inward is where you take your stigma and you internalize it. I'm going to keep it a secret, I'm going to hide, I'm going to whatever. Usually during the secular identity process, when people first start to realize that they're not religious, or they start telling other people that they're not religious, they tend to be inward about things. And after they get more comfortable with it and realize that there are other people like them out there, they get involved in groups like this, they tend to be very much more outward. So they're more likely to wear the friendly atheist t-shirt that Red McCall wears all the time, or some of those types of things where you're more outward about it. So I've got two variables. The first one is educated others, and I asked, and I got a really high percentage on this, what percentage of atheists in the United States have ever educated someone about atheists? And the example I gave is, for example, told someone religious that atheists can have morals too, or something along those lines. And over 70% of American atheists. Even more Canadians have done it. Fewer Europeans, about the same amount of Australians, and fewer Asians. And then the other measure was, have you ever outed yourself? And it wasn't just outed yourself as atheist. Have you ever outed yourself for the specific reason of reducing stigma towards atheists? In other words, I outed myself so that other people know there are atheists around here. I'm not just doing it to a family member so that they know I'm an atheist. I'm doing it to reduce stigma and as a social statement. And while not as common, between 40 and 50% of Americans, a few more Canadians, and then Europe and Australia, and especially Asia, less likely to find people who are willing to out themselves. How I make sense of this data is, in the United States, we're far more likely to experience inward and outward stigma management, even though it seems like that's a contradictory thing. But if you think about it, if you're more stigmatized early on in your secular identity construction, you're going to be insular, and then as you come out, you're going to have a lot of fire, and you're going to have a lot of ambition in terms of countering the stigma that you felt. Like when I did a lot of qualitative interviews with atheists, and one of the things that I heard over and over again was, I was really pissed that I had to be in the closet for that long, that I felt that repressed, and I had this need to tell everybody. I talked to a lot of atheist group leaders, and what they told me is whenever someone new came to the group, it was venting time. Like that was the first couple months, they wanted to tell everybody every bad thing that had ever happened to them because they were atheists. And then after that, they just wanted to eat spaghetti. They chilled out for a while. It was something with spaghetti. I don't know if it's the flying spaghetti monster, but like I sat in with these groups and all around Nebraska, and everywhere we went, it was always a spaghetti meetup every time. So, and then after, you could always spot the new guy, because the new guy was like fuming in the corner about I can't believe the Catholic Church did, And so, and then the people who had been there for a while, they had mellowed out a bit, and they just kind of wanted to hang out with other people who shared similar views as them. Okay, so discussion. What does this all mean? This is going to take me a while to get through this. So, why is the US so much more religious than the rest of the world? I think this is really what this gets to. So if we look at atheist stigma being much higher in the US than it is in other parts of the world, or at least significantly more so, we have to come back to this question, which is, why is the United States so much more religious than the rest of the world? So I don't have an exact answer for the rest of the world, but we do have a really good comparison between the United States and Europe. And we can look at essentially what religious adherence looks like between these two countries, or these two continents. So in the 1970s, there was a sociologist named Peter Berger, and he came up with the secularization theory, wrote a book called The Sacred Canopy. And essentially what he said, and he was looking at Europe specifically. And Ben, if I write over here, are you going to be able to pick that up?
Up to that line.
Okay, all right. So if we want to think about religion as a canopy, and you've got this belief and this belief and this belief and this belief and this belief. You've got a lot of different beliefs. If all of these are A, it's okay. If everybody around you has belief A, you're cool. So you don't ever have to have that threatened. If everybody's belief is B or everybody's belief is C, like, your religion gets to exist, because you don't ever encounter anybody with a different view, like a different idea that, oh, this is my God says this. But the problem is, Berger saw in Europe, we've got A, B, C, D, and E emerging, and all these religions under the same canopy. And he said the canopy can't hold, because if I'm a Protestant and I'm living next to a Catholic, and I've got a Jewish neighbor and I've got a Muslim neighbor, and they're all pretty good people that I like, and they've all got completely different religious views, like that's a threat to my religious belief. That's going to break down religious belief. And Peter Berger announced the end of religion in 1970s. I think it was like 1971. He said, this is the end of religion, and we're going to see a decrease in religion like we've never seen before. And he's talking specifically about Europe. He said the United States isn't too far behind Europe. So he was predicting that the United States was going to see a drastic drop-off in religion. So I think it was in 2000, maybe 2004. This is 30 plus years after he had made this original declaration. He stood up in front of the American Sociological Association and ate his words and said, I was wrong. This was not what happened. Secularization didn't hit the United States. It did in Europe. And now we had this problem. why did Europe become so secular when the United States didn't? So we've had a few researchers that came along. It's a really good book. It's mostly historical, but it's got some really cool economic features. It's called The Churching of America by Finke and Stark, Rodney Stark and Roger Finke. And they came up with a different theory, and this is the religious economies theory. And this is what they said. They said, in Europe, it makes sense that if you've got two different religions under the same canopy, if you've got multiple religions, these multiple diverse perspectives, the people are going to start losing faith. And they say this is why. Because if you're in Norway, you can be a Lutheran or you can be a Catholic, and if you don't like any of those, you can just say, forget it, I'm not going to be anything, right? And so in Norway and Sweden, people have decided, I'm not going to be anything. I don't want to be Catholic, I don't want to be Lutheran, I'm just going to fall out. The other problem that Europe had that the United States didn't is the United States is very unique in its separation of church and state. That is a concept that is very unique to the United States. We have, as religious as we are, it seems strange that that's part of who we are, but you will not find another European country like this. Their church and state, it's really not uncommon to see them more entangled than it is here. So in that sense, religion starts losing its sacredness because it's just kind of intertwined with other things, and people stop caring about it. It just doesn't matter so much. So what the religious economies theory did was propose a free market model, and as a socialist, this drives me nuts, but I have to agree. So we can use capitalism to explain religious economies. So first off, Finke and Stark said, here's where Berger got it wrong. Religion in the United States, so we'll get to 2015, but let's just look at 1776. Actually, I'll write it down here. So if we want to look at 1776 to 1992, if this is religious adherence, so this is 100% and this is 0%. This is the percentage of Americans who are an adherent in a church. In 1992, we were at 93%. 93% of Americans were religious. Remember, 7% were nuns. That means 93% had a religion. So Finke and Stark actually went through historical records of church memberships, compared it with people who actually lived in the counties, all the way back to 1776, and this is essentially what they found. 16%. At the time of our country's founding, 16% of people were actually a member of a religious denomination. Roger Finke said, in 1776, a young woman is more likely to go out, get drunk on Saturday night, and get drunk and knocked up on Saturday night than they were to go to church on Sunday morning. We were not religious. We were not a religious society at all. We were a very secular society. It was a pushback from Puritan society. By 1776, people really weren't even that much concerned in religion. And we had kind of these, during the 1800s, there was a huge increase in religious participation, and then it kind of dipped down again. The 1950s, we saw huge, enormous expansions of Episcopalian churches and Presbyterian churches. And then during the turbulent 60s and 70s, things started to decline. So what Peter Berger was experiencing, what he was witnessing, was kind of that decline, which was the response to the aftershock of the counterculture. But during the Reagan 80s, religious adherence boomed again and topped out at 93%. So what happened since 1992? If we want to look at the last 20 years, it's gone down again. So we are in the midst of a serious dip right now. And what sociologists are trying to figure out is this increase in the nuns, is this a temporary thing? Is this the millennials just not going to church and they're going to go back later? Or is this an actual trend? Are we actually seeing secularization happening in the United States? Yet to be determined, but this is what we know. The reason why religion is so prevalent in the United States has to do with the fact that we make religion so easy and so diverse. It's easier here than it is anywhere else in the world. So I've got this term up here, the upstart sects. The upstart sects were essentially like the 1820s, and we were talking about Baptists, and we're talking about Methodists. And I'm going to use an economic term here, startup cost. So if you were to go out and start a business, any kind of business, let's say you wanted to start a bakery. There's a lot of things you got to buy for a bakery. There's a lot of like high-tech ovens that you've got to have. There's materials. You got to rent out space, opposed to something with low startup costs. So if you wanted to go to county fairs and sell cotton candy, you need a little cart and you need some sugar and some food coloring, and you're ready to go. there are less costs associated with the cotton candy little cart. Not only that, you don't have to rent space, you don't have to get a permit from the city. There are a lot of official things you don't have to go through. It is if you can make a lot of money off of that cotton candy stand, that's a great way to make money because you have very little input that you have to put into it in economic terms. So let's think about this in terms of churches. If you want another Catholic church in Oklahoma City, it has to come all the way from the top, right? You can't just decide we're going to make another Catholic parish. It doesn't work that way. There has to be people who are on the higher ups who say, okay, we need to redistrict and figure out what area it's going to be in, make sure we've got zoning for that building, we've got to find a priest, we've got to make sure there are enough people to fill. So in other words, it's going to take years and years. It's a lot of startup cost. Presbyterian church, same thing. Lutheran church, same thing. So what happened in the 1820s? The Baptists came along. And what did they do? They met in tents. And Bob's the pastor, right? So if you want to start a Presbyterian church, you have to find a minister who has a Master's of Divinity from a Presbyterian accredited divinity school. To be a Baptist minister, you just have to have the love of Jesus in your heart, right? And a very charismatic way of speaking, and you get to be a Baptist minister, like my brother. So, and the Methodists were kind of the same. The Methodists have changed since then. They're more mainline. But the Baptists, that evangelical tradition, that's why evangelicals were so ignited, and that's why they were so successful early on. No cost whatsoever. And this still happens. Evangelical churches start in the living rooms of people who decide they want a church. That's essentially what happens. And so it's really, really easy to get one of these churches up and going. So upstart sects came from this idea that there were very few costs to getting a church started. Let's talk about the economic models, supply and demand. So now that we've got these upstart sects and they're moving along and we've got, it's not just Presbyterian and Congregationalists and Catholic and Lutheran. Man, we got Baptists in the mix, we got Methodists in the mix. And think about what Peter Berger said. If you have too many churches in there, it's going to break the canopy because the Baptists are going to be looking at the Catholics, looking at the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, and saying, whoa, 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 whoa. We can't all be right. Someone's got to be wrong. And for some reason, it didn't happen in the United States. And this is what happened. So if we're really thirsty and we're all going to throw down $1, if the only thing to drink is Coke, Coca-Cola, so show of hands, how many people are in that market? Your choice is Coke or nothing. It's going to cost $1. Who's in the market? Hands up. Okay. What if the choices are Coke and water? Hands up. Coke, water, or nothing? So you can get Coke, you can get water, or you can get nothing. Or Coke or water, who's in the market? Okay, what if I expanded to coffee? Beer? You're still not in. Juice? Bourbon? That's okay. So let me explain it like this. If the only thing there is to drink is Coke, or nothing at all, like only people who really like Coke, or at least like Coke to some extent, are going to be in that market. And some people aren't even going to be that excited about Coke, right?
I was thinking if you had the choice, if you were thirsty and you had the choice between Coke and nothing, I'd take Coke.
Oh, okay. I see. That makes sense, I guess. So
even though I would rather have water, I'd take Coke. And then if you add water, oh no.
touche. So let's think about it this way. Let's say it's more for enjoyment rather than necessity. So those of you who are in it for Coke, there's going to be a few hands. If I add orange juice to it, if I add beer, if I add whatever, as the choices increase, more hands start to go up. What that means is market participation has just increased. We've just increased market participation. Why? Because we have appealed to niche markets. Niche markets are little niches that people like. So I made, okay, if the only beer available is Bud Light and Coors Light, I'm just not drinking beer that day. Okay, you've got to give me some kind of craft option or something like that before I even get in the market. So that is a perfect example of a niche market, right? Finding little markets to get people participating. What's weird is that in the United States, we didn't have this response to other religions being out there as a threat to our own. It just didn't happen. We were able to deal with that. Part of it had to do with our tradition of the separation of church and state, where in Europe, the only choices you have are Catholic or Lutheran, and if you don't like those, you stay home. And there's not enough choices to saturate the market. So the United States was able to capture on market saturation of churches, while Europe wasn't, creating this huge boom in the number of people who decided to participate in a religion between 1776 and 1992. So if you want to think about churchgoers as consumers, and you want to think about churches as businesses or firms, and think about all religions as an economy or a market, so we can get the macro, the meso, the micro level. So remaining religions, or remaining religious, here's some other things. The reason why we remained religious for so long, some of it had to do with brand loyalty. Some people, okay, who in here is a Mac person? You're an Apple fan. Like, you would not buy a PC. None? How is that possible? We're atheists. So I actually know several people who wouldn't be caught dead with a PC. Like, Apple has created this brand loyalty that is absolutely amazing, where you've got people who are absolutely, almost like cultishly devoted to Apple products in the same way that people are to religions. And here's what we know. This is the free rider elimination. It seems like the more restrictive of a religion it would be, that would be bad, but it's actually the opposite. The more conservative and restrictive that religions got, the more people got into their own brand. So if you propose that, man, we've got the answer and all these other people are full of shit, like, you're more likely to show up because you've got the right brand. You've got the right answer, whatever it happens to be, and you're in on the secret, right? And so what you do is you start a church up where we've got Sunday worship, and then you've got maybe Bowling for Jesus on Wednesday, and then you've got Bible study on Tuesday, and you've got these other things on Thursday and Friday and Saturday. Pretty soon your whole week is filled up with church activities, and that gets rid of the free riders. The people who are just there to kind of like hang out and be part of a church, they can't keep up with that. So you've got your devoted few that are there with you that expands to the devoted many. So through brand loyalty, conservative churches especially, the reasons why evangelicals are winning in the market for a while anyways, is because of that. Rodney Stark had a great way of explaining this. He said the reason why mainline churches are dying is because there's no consequences anymore. So mainline churches, heaven and hell isn't talked about very much. We're talking about like Episcopalians, Congregationalists, Lutherans, Methodists. They're more open and affirming, more accepting of gay marriage. They're more accepting of liberal viewpoints. And Rodney Stark said, if the threat of hell goes away, the promise of heaven isn't far behind. And that's why evangelical churches have survived and remained strong. Because if your liberal theology is only one step away from not going to church, man, I can save myself a lot of time by not showing up on Sunday. And that's why we're seeing these declines. So what we're seeing right now is this decline, and that has to do with liberal churches, with people who grew up in liberal politics, who look at their church and they're like, I don't see anything unique about this whatsoever. This is just the same as I could stay home and think the same thing. Okay, so what about the future of American religion and secularism? This is the point that I brought up earlier. We don't really know where we're going. We're down to about 75% of people who still identify as religious, and among millennials, maybe only about 70%, if not lower than that. So this has dipped down below the numbers that were even prevalent during the 1960s. This is something that has churches very concerned, trying to figure out how they're going to deal with this growing level of secularism. And I actually don't have an answer. I can't even there's been so many shocks and aftershocks that I wouldn't be surprised if it did happen, if we did get another religious boom. But it looks like the trend is starting to move downward, and that's been consistent the last 20 plus years. So anyways, I'm going to leave you with that. I don't really have a whole lot, but questions are welcome. So I'm going to open up the floor. Yeah, I think you had your hand up.